we are good to begin. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this international online rally. It's all about peace now. Of course, it's almost 12 months on through this grueling war in Ukraine. So this meeting comes at the absolute right time. My name is Shadia Edwards-Dashti, and I'll be chairing this Stop the War Coalition meeting today. Of course, we're seeing at the moment pro-war Western leaders are all ramping up rhetoric, trying to galvanize leaders to pump more weapons into Ukraine. Now, we know that that is not the answer to peace. That will not bring an end to this conflict. And that's what today's rally is all about, trying to put forward an alternative viewpoint, an alternative path to peace. We have an amazing array of speakers that are joining us this evening from all over the world, and each speaker will be speaking for around 7 minutes. And so without further ado, we'll kick off then with our first speaker, who actually joins us from across the Atlantic Ocean, live indeed, a co-founder of CodePink. It's Medea Benjamin. Thanks so much for joining us. I know it's very early in the morning for you.
Hey, great to be with you. Yes, I'm on a 50-city speaking tour around the United States, trying to pump up some opposition in this country, which is very hard to do given the media propaganda and what is happening in our Congress, where it's just about uniform between the Democrats and the Republicans to give support for this war, with the exception of a small group of right-wing Republicans. We've got the entire Democratic Party in Congress solidly behind pumping more weapons into this war. You know, first we were told Patriot missiles, that will lead to victory. Then we were told, oh no, now it's the HIMARS, this will lead to victory. Now, of course, it's the tanks, and immediately after getting the okay for the tanks, we hear the call for fighter jets. What comes after that? Is it troops? Is it nuclear weapons? Our so-called leaders in the West are taking us directly into either a wider world war or a nuclear war. In the meantime, we see more and more evidence that the thesis that we have laid out, those of us in the peace movement, is correct. For example, saying that while we totally condemn the Russian invasion, we also condemn the fact that people in the West have tried to stop negotiations. We have done a lot of work trying to expose the way that Boris Johnson and the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin from the US torpedoed the negotiations that were going on 1 month after the invasion. And the officials in the US and the West have said, oh, that's not true, despite the fact that we've heard this from negotiators on the Turkish side. We've heard this actually from people negotiating on the Ukrainian side. And now we have Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who talks about himself shuttling around between Moscow and Kyiv and trying to get both sides to come to the negotiating table. And he said he was making progress and that both sides really wanted to see a ceasefire until the West came in and blocked that. We also hear now more recently how the efforts to end this conflict back in 2015 were torpedoed by Ukraine and by the West. And I'm talking about the Minsk Accords here that we hear from Angela Merkel and from Francois Hollande, who were in charge of Germany and France at the time, saying that those very accords, which the world thought was to end the conflict in the Donbass, was actually to buy time to send in more weapons, to train the Ukrainian army so that they could go in and physically take back the Donbass. We've also heard very recently about the issue of the Nord Stream pipeline. And when the pipeline was blown up, stopping the possibility of sending gas from Russia to Germany and to Europe, we were told in the West that this was Russia that blew up its own pipeline. And it took an independent journalist, Cy Hirsch, who used to write for very establishment publications like the New York Times, had to publish on his own blog site an expose laying out how this pipeline was blown up by the US with the help of Norway. We don't hear this in the mainstream media, but it takes now independent journalists to publish this kind of thing on their own blog sites. We are hearing more and more voices that are saying that there is no such thing as victory in the battlefield. We heard it from the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US. That is the #1 political advisor to Biden, saying victory is very unlikely on the battlefield, that we should go to the negotiating table. And we've also heard it from people like Eric Vad, the general who was the top advisor to Angela Merkel for many years, who said, there will be no military victory, that negotiations is the only way. He said anything else is pure militarism and a senseless waste of human life. And so here we are 1 year into this horrific war, where we, the people of the world, have to come forward and push our governments to recognize that the only way to move this from the battlefield is to go to the negotiating table. And I want to end my section here by quoting somebody who I see as a real leader, and that is President Lula from Brazil, because he was just meeting with Biden in the United States, and he has been getting a lot of pressure, as have countries around the world, to send weapons to Ukraine. And he said, no, we're not going to send weapons to Ukraine. We need to find interlocutors who can sit with President Putin and show him the mistake he made to invade Ukraine's territory, and show the Ukrainians that they need to talk so we can end this war. He said, I will not send weapons. I don't want to join this war. I want to end this war. And this is the kind of leadership that we need around the world. Leaders like Lula, who we need to follow, and we need to push the, quote, leaders in our country to follow that same line, to stop the escalation and start the negotiations. Thank you very much for the honor of talking to you all today, and I look forward to working together as we push our countries to find real leadership and get to the peace table now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Medea. It's so great to have you on this call today. Of course, you've been so monumental in the peace movement over in the United States. So it's really great that you're here on this international platform, pushing that idea that the only real solution is a ceasefire and negotiated settlement. And that's really at the crux of what this meeting is all about. This rally today is putting forward that peaceful argument. So moving on then to our next speaker. This is an activist, a comrade from Ukraine. He's actually the executive secretary of the Ukrainian pacifist movement and has been with the Stop the War Coalition from the very beginning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Today, he sent us a message of solidarity on this platform. It's Yurii Sheliazhenko.
Or in Westminster Hall, Zelensky told how he felt when sitting in Churchill's chair. He received a standing ovation. Nobody asked him, how dare he imprison people who refuse to kill fellow humans out of imperative of conscience. Nobody quoted him words of Winston Churchill about conscientious objection. The rights which have been granted in this war and the last to conscientious objectors are well known and are a definite part of British policy. Anything in the nature of persecution, victimization, or manhunting is odious to the British people. Apparently, elected representatives of British people today have no objections against persecution, victimization, or manhunting, providing that so-called Democrats who organize that are ruling and are organizing mass murder, which is war in other countries, while came to London only occasionally to obtain more weapons, to invest their war profits into property at the Baker Street, and of course to drink tea with a king. Why it is happening? Where is old-fashioned peace-loving voices of decent British people, hard workers, who are robbed of their welfare to drag the country, Europe, and the world into new disastrous war? Why Labour leader is in the front row of those who are applauding according to Zelensky bloodlust. You know, I tried to learn that from the website of Labour Party. And I found that despite loud voices about support for Ukraine, all Ukrainians are denied from visiting the Labour website. Access denied because of geographical restrictions. It is true. I tried different internet service providers. I could easily open the website of the conservatives, but Ukrainian IPs are banned by the Labour Party, which is dancing to the warmongering tune of conservatives. Still, I managed to find a vector. I opened Labour website in Google Cache, and I found nothing reassuring. There is a speech of David Lammy about the pitiful commitment to NATO and nuclear weapons. And for those who believe the lies in media about so-called decisive battle this spring, refusing to see reality of planned and financed multi-decade war in Ukraine, I will quote the Shadow Secretary for Foreign Affairs, who said, UK will stand with Ukraine for the long haul. Long haul. Another speech at the Labour Party website, which appalled and outraged me, is a speech of the Shadow Defense Secretary, John Haley, which openly tries to bribe working people, or probably rather corrupted union leaders, with a share in war profiteering. He said, those who call stop the war more loudly than win the war are playing into Putin's hands. Really? Has the UK already declared war on Russia? How are you supposed to win the war? By pressing the red button? Are you sure there will be any winners when all life on earth will be killed? Dear friends, don't mind this obvious lies, and please continue to call to stop the war. Peace movements and replacement of armies with nonviolent resistance to war and militarism is the only hope to cure humankind from the cancer tumor of nukes, armies, military-industrial complexes, and oppressive governance. We must end this dark epoch of irresponsible leaders, such as Putin, Zelensky, and their bellicose backers in polarized mode. And we can use better kind of policies shown by Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King to build a more just world without violence. Your voice against the war and your will to stop the war is good and necessary. Please continue to stand up against the war. If all peoples will refuse to kill or support killing, there will be no wars.
Sorry about that technical difficulty, just had trouble unmuting myself, but I am back. Thank you, Yurii, for that brilliant contribution. So important to have that voice from Ukraine, and so inspiring to hear from him as well. As he said, there can be no winners in this war, especially if it escalates. And I think that was really an important point that he stressed. And of course, we will be marching here in central London on February the 25th to say no to war and peace now. And I hope that every single one of you, those of you that can are in the vicinity of central London or can get down to central London, will be there on February the 25th. In fact, there are now 332 people on this call right now. And that means that all of us can play such a huge part in spreading the message as wide and far as possible to mobilize to make sure that that demonstration is as big as we can possibly make it. Moving on then to our next speaker this evening, Rafaella Bolini. She's an amazing activist, part of the socialist organization in Italy. She's helped organize numerous demonstrations, mobilizing in and across Europe. She's absolutely dedicated and committed to the issue of disarmament. So we'll pass over now to Rafaella.
I'm very happy to be with you this night because 20 years ago tonight, we were entering together the vigil of the largest global demonstration never organized in the world, February 15 against the war in Iraq. It was a common challenge, a common work, and a common enormous result. And so I'm really happy to share with you the vigil of this anniversary, because I hope it can sign the beginning of a new common story in this tragic moment, the war again inside Europe and all our countries involved in the conflict. I have not to tell anything. Every day the level of the confrontation increases, militarization, rearmament, military expenditure grew up. Every day we run the risk of a war enlargement and the danger of a nuclear war. And all these disasters plunged in a real, already dramatical context, the climate collapse, the skyrocketing inequality, pandemic crisis. We should be in billions in the streets, but we know that it's not easy. In our society, even among our people, even among our activists, everything is more difficult than 20 years ago. We come from years of social fragmentation, and we lack social movement convergences, mainly, especially at the European level. And the crisis have pushed our people to focus on themselves and on their own difficulties in their own life and community. And we are immersed in a mainstream narrative that really now consider war as a normal tool for politics. The responsibility of the international community to stop the war has completely disappeared from the mainstream discourse. The UN is completely out of the picture, without tools and without credibility. And we have also to tell ourselves that times have really changed compared to other phases of the peace movement. The struggle for global and regional hegemony is done now by many more actors, state and non-state actors in the global field, in addition to the United States. And many of these actors, most of them, let's only think about Erdogan, are autocracies, anti-democratic, reactionary, nationalistic government, and in Europe too, extreme right-wing governments are on the rise. So, of course, we cannot trust them. We cannot trust this global fragmented and fighting leadership. They will not work at all in the interest of peace, of social and climate justice. And I think that despite the difficulties, there is no other way. We have to take on ourselves our responsibility, and we have to mobilize. I agree that the entering of Lula in the scene can help a lot. Let's raise our voice, because this will reinforce also his efforts. And tell us, the truth. I think that Ukrainian people have the right to resist, but the international community has, according to the international right and law, another completely different task. It has the duty to stop the war and to assert international legality through diplomacy and peaceful means. And nobody does not have the right to drag the world into a global war. Nobody has this right. And we know that NATO has helped a lot in bringing us into this disaster with its policy of expansion and enlargement. We know that the European Union as well as the US have chosen isolation instead of integration of Russia, instead of building a common security project, and they have contributed a lot to increase the Putin frustration and spirit of revenge. So in this kind of situation, our platform, the platform of Europe for Peace, is very simple. Ceasefire now, international negotiation, no more escalation. Peace is the only victory, and support to anyone refuse the war in Ukraine and in Russia. It has been our platform in Italy since the first day of the war. In Italy, the coalition to stop the war is very large, united, and represents the majority of the population, even if the government, since the first day of the war, follow a completely different line. We have organized very big national mobilization in March and in November, and many national mobilization days spread in hundreds towns. And we also on 24th, 25th, and 26th of March, we will be in the street in 100 town. This time we will be in a good company. Demonstration will be held not only in the UK, but also in Belgium, Holland, France, Spain, Austria, Germany, and Denmark on the same platform. And so I think that this link we are establishing among us tell us that we have to create bridges, connection, relations. Let us be seen by the public opinion in Europe together. Let's find also in the next months the opportunity to meet together. Let's try to give strength to another approach, to another vision, to another way out from this nightmare. We can do it. We did it. We can do it again.
Thanks so much, Rafaella. I think that's such an important note to end on. We did it once and we can do it again. It's really important to get out onto the streets and mobilize, come together and raise our voices, as Rafaella really stressed there. Public opinion is in our favor, and we have to stay with that and believe in that and have it there to inspire us to get onto the streets and to demonstrate. So moving on to our next speaker then, it's Tariq Ali. He's a writer, an activist, a long-time leading figure on the international left, and of course, a leading anti-imperialist activist as well. Tariq, over to you.
Yeah, let us look at the situation in Ukraine at the moment. The Ukrainians have for some months now been on the defensive. Any notion that they're winning the war is just rubbish. We have, if you like, a World War I situation which people dug in the trenches and fighting away. And if it follows that pattern, the war, the side which has a larger population, industrially more advanced, etc., usually wins, unless there's outside intervention. That's the first point to make. The second point is this. It's no longer a question of supporting Putin. No, nobody on the left I know has supported Putin, really. The question is how to stop the war. And the best way to stop the war is direct negotiations between the Ukrainians and the Russians. This now NATO and the United States has stopped. When we talk about an international community, there isn't one. So we shouldn't use that phrase. It's the phrase used by the establishment to obfuscate and confuse. It's essentially the United States which is determining how this war proceeds, and its NATO allies, with the marginal exception of Turkey, is following suit. For some time now, the United States has not been happy with the Germans. Why? I mean, sometimes in the early years of the century, I was in Berlin debating with Donald Rumsfeld's legal advisor in front of a German audience. It's Sunday morning debates they had in their largest theater. And to my astonishment, she turned on the audience, which wasn't sympathetic, and said, you know what's wrong with you Germans is you're cowards. And the whole audience went, oh. And the reason she said that was because Schroeder had refused to send troops to Iraq. They made the mistake of doing it in Afghanistan, but then they retreated. And later, Angela Merkel had refused to participate in the invasion and bombing of Libya. So they were very keen to blood the Germans, so to speak. And now they've come closer to it than at any other time since the Second World War. And Olaf Scholz, who in the 1980s was a leader of the Young Socialists, totally for disarmament, campaigning against missiles being situated in Germany, is the chancellor, the first German chancellor since Hitler, who will be sending tanks to Russia and to Ukraine to supposedly fight the Russians under huge American pressure. He insisted that Germans would only do it if the Americans sent their tanks. And so the Americans are sending tanks in there too. So the question that arises is, who is fighting Russia? For a long time now, several months, the West has been using its own forces to sabotage the pipeline. As we now know, it was an American operation, and they don't deny it. Cy Hirsch's piece is very, very good, not published in any single newspaper. So to what extent is this now a war between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and the United States of America via the US's NATO puppet states in Europe? I think it is now very close, if it hasn't already become a war between the United States and Russia being waged on Ukrainian soil at the moment. So what do the Americans want? Basically, I think what the ultras, as Medea pointed out, there are differences from the Pentagon and between some sections of the Pentagon and the White House. Not the first time. The Pentagon or some people in it were nervous about Afghanistan. They were nervous even about Iraq. And they said, what are the war aims? This is what they want to know, and this is what they want to know now. What are our war aims? Are we going to have regime change? Are we going to really send people in to remove Putin and put in someone from the army in power there? What is the aim? The ultras in the United States, both Democrats and Republicans, say that the aim should be regime change and we should get rid of Putin. Well, that means that unless there's a huge eruption in Russia itself, and Putin is removed by a mass movement of the army, which doesn't look likely because it's, a very disorganized situation there too. The only way of doing that is to encourage the Russians basically to use nuclear weapons. And if nuclear weapons are used, and it may seem shocking to say this, one of the targets will be the British, who have been extremely active and unrestrained in promoting the war and in demanding that the war actually be escalated. Because carrying on armaments, for what purpose? What is the purpose if it is not to escalate the war? And it's against this that we in Stop the War argue, instead of escalating the war, all the big parties in parliament and the teeny ones too are for this escalation. Arm, rearmament, arm them, give them more arms. For what? To escalate the war. And that war escalation means the Ukrainians will be pushed aside more and more by their own side, because once you have the NATO High Command taking over the war, they make the decisions. And when we say NATO, we mean the US, as the British discovered in Afghanistan and other places. So the only way out of this war is a negotiated a negotiated settlement. Sometimes people say, pro-Putin people say to me, but if Putin hadn't made war, what should he have done? Well, I'll tell you what he should have done. He should have gone to the Security Council and called an emergency debate and said, this is what is going on, what are you people going to do? He should have traveled the world explaining what their position was. That probably would have led to a better situation without a war and a settlement. But he decided on war because he got fed up with what the US had been up to for a long, long time and made this crazy decision thinking he would win it within 3 weeks. Well, he was clearly misinformed, and he's suffered as a result. Russians suffer, the Russian people are suffering. The Russian peace movement was very active. And so we now have a situation where this is basically becoming, or has become, I don't have all the facts and figures, a war of NATO against Russia. And when we say NATO, we mean the United States. And the European Union, of course, is totally on side, incapable of playing any independent role whatsoever. So we have to do what we can. We shouldn't imagine we will get a large turnout on the 25th. We should try for it, because precisely when you live in a country where the entire establishment, the entire media, and what used to pass for the left in the Labour Party, completely in favor of escalation on the argument that Putin started the war. Well, we know wars are started by, but we also have to learn how to bring them to an end. And I think the statements of John McDonnell, the silence of some of the best people in Parliament today, the young women MPs, is pretty bad. And it doesn't augur well for the future of politics in England, at any rate, even if Labour wins or becomes part of a coalition government in a few years' time. So it is dependent on us. Even if we get 5,000 to 6,000 people out, it'd be a huge triumph. Let's not even think beyond that. Let's say, let's try and get 5,000 to 6,000 people out, people who are not on either side, but who want this war to end and who are insisting now that we have negotiations. So we have to try and change the way this war is being presented and the way this war is being perceived. Because when you threaten a big power like Russia, having isolated it on various levels for the last 10 years, if not more, then anything is possible. And once politicians on whichever side get the bit between their teeth saying, come what may, no one is going to force us to do A, B, and C, then the use of nuclear weapons or partial nuclear weapons is not excluded. And Britain is a target. Have no doubt about that. That is one reason for the hysteria, one reason why Labour MPs are being told they'll be expelled if they sign Stop the War movements, and they've capitulated and caved in. And that is why those of us who are not bound by those pressures of the British state have to do something and come out on the 25th of February to show that there are a handful of us at any rate who will not accept the lies being told by either side in this war. But we want the war to end via a negotiated settlement, which is the way most wars end, and there is no other solution. So I would urge all those to make a real effort and turn up on the first anniversary of the war, because the longer it goes on, the more dangerous becomes the situation, both in the Ukraine and Russia, in Europe as a whole, and globally. Because how this war ends is going to determine what happens in other parts of the world. It's going to determine how the United States is going to deal with China, which is not Russia, as we know. Much more important economically, industrially, and increasingly militarily. And its differences are with other Chinese people, not with any other ethnic group. So attempting to provoke conflicts in that region would be a total disaster. So what we are talking about, actually, not to sound too pompous about it, is world peace. That is what that could be shattered if there's any threat of nuclear weapons, which there has been, and if these weapons are actually used. I mean, we talk about climate change, and heaven knows it's important enough, but if these so-called great powers, if the citizens who live in NATO land are sleepwalking to disaster, then we are in trouble. So do turn up at this demonstration, please.
Thanks so much, Tariq, for that really, really good analysis there, really helpful as well for us all to understand the context in which we are speaking. Just before we move on to our next speaker, unfortunately, MEP Claire Daly is unable to make it today. She does send her solidarity. She wishes that she could be with us today, but she is unfortunately held up at the European Parliament. But moving on then, and following on so well from Tariq's analysis, we move on to Kate Hudson, who's the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and no doubt she will pick up from where Tariq left off. Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Shadia. Thought I was being told I couldn't unmute myself there. It's great to be here with so many of you this evening, internationally as well as from here in Britain. It's great to be with such a strong panel of anti-war speakers. So I'll just start by reminding everyone that last month the hands on the doomsday clock were moved to 90 seconds to midnight. And this is the closest that we've ever been to existential catastrophe. And of course, it's not surprising given what's happened over the past year. Of course, Ukraine is the biggest factor in this change towards the midnight hour. We've had nuclear threats from Putin. We're having the test of new Russian nuclear-capable missiles expected at any time. And then you think also that the arsenals of Russia and NATO states together total around 12,000 nuclear weapons, most of them many times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. So you would imagine that in that kind of context, with that level of danger on both sides, that every attempt would be made to lessen tensions and work for a negotiated settlement. You'd imagine that people at all costs would want to avoid a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, because such a war, as Tariq indicated, would be almost certain to become a nuclear war. But no, at every stage there have been voices calling for escalation, not only in government, but across society as well, and across the left too, unfortunately. We've heard calls for a no-fly zone, we've heard calls for heavy weaponry, tanks it is now. Where can this possibly end? So the likelihood of this war ending in existential disaster is just increasing from day to day. And I absolutely agree with Tariq that Britain will be a key target. Now, last month we heard from Chief Warmonger Boris Johnson in Davos saying that, oh, it's just all a bluff from Russia, that Putin's nuclear threats should be ignored. And Johnson's Davos speech really displayed his complete divorce from reality. And one of the incredibly stupid things that he said was, nonsense, he's not going to use nuclear weapons. Okay, he's like the fat boy in Dickens. He wants to make our flesh creep. He wants us to think about it. He's never going to do it. I mean, this guy was our prime minister, for God's sake. But, how out of touch with reality. And this, of course, is from the man who, as prime minister, insisted that he would press the nuclear button. And I'm sure we all remember that whole shameful circus where we saw politicians queuing up to say they were willing to press the button, as if you were unfit to be a prime minister if you wouldn't wipe out humanity. Just a complete disgrace. And what has actually been happening during this war is softening us up for nuclear use. I'm sure we've all noticed that over the past month, that there's been a lot of talk about tactical or so-called battlefield nukes, as if they aren't very dangerous, as if they're just small little things that can be confined in a kind of limited area. And of course, there is no such thing. You cannot contain radiation on a battlefield. It just means devastation for an entire region, and very likely a first step to all-out nuclear war. And throughout the war, we've seen disregard for the risks of escalation, not just from the Tories, of course, or even from the Labour leadership. It's been appalling to hear those supposedly on Labour's left, like John McDonnell, Tariq referred also to this, saying that we should send tanks, a bit hand-wringing there from him, but basically, clearly saying that we should be sending tanks. And to me, it put me in mind of the whole sorry story from the early days of the First World War, where many on the left abandoned their class-based peace principles and supported that catastrophic war that resulted in millions dead. And I very strongly believe the working class movement should have prevented that war. It could have been prevented. And because it's ordinary people who are dying in this war, now looking like it's in the hundreds of thousands. And let's not forget what one very powerful speaker said at the TUC Congress last year, when there was a debate going on about increasing military spending, which members of the TUC were actually arguing for. He said, there is a worker on both ends of a bayonet, and that was true in the First World War, and it is true now. How can any decent person fail to call for negotiations, for peace talks to end this terrible war? So who is benefiting from this war? Well, certainly the arms manufacturers. And I keep on reading online these long lists of weaponry being sent to Ukraine from so many different countries, all this military kit. It's just so shocking. And at what cost to the people, not only of Ukraine and Russia who are dying as a result, but what cost to the peoples of those countries that are sending it, that are basically having to pay for these weapons? Untold billions are being spent by governments, who then also say there is no money for public services or for decent wages. We have this exact problem here, and it is mirrored elsewhere. And I was reading a report today that British arms companies are actually discussing plans to set up shop in Ukraine, and that they've got their chief execs meeting with their counterparts in Kyiv to discuss starting joint ventures to manufacture weapons and military vehicles locally. And the arms companies in France and Germany are also trying to get in on the act. It's just an arms sales bonanza. It's completely, absolutely shocking and dreadful. And on the subject of spending, I'm beginning to wind up here, Shadia. On the subject of spending, what is truly obscene is the failure of our government that is spending so much on killing to actually help those suffering in Turkey and Syria as a result of the terrible earthquake. I was reading today that one single anonymous donor, a Pakistani businessman, has given $30 million to aid the suffering, which is many, many times more than the derisory amount given by the British government. But I do take heart today, I was reading about it today, from the enormous support. There's now over 350,000 signatures for the petition in Germany coming from Sarah Wagenknecht and Alex Schwarzer, calling on Scholz to take a lead on negotiating for peace. And that's just been in a matter of just a few days, that level of support for that initiative. And it was reported that 58% of the voters said they would like to see their leaders make greater efforts to forge a deal. Absolutely, that's what's necessary. And they are really building on that now. And they're likely to have a huge demonstration in Berlin on the 25th. So we need that sentiment expressed and active here. And we also need a big demonstration on the 25th of February. So please do what you can to build it. Our government has actively blocked peace initiatives and is the most gung-ho for war. They must be forced to change. And the left and progressive movement, whether inside the Labour Party or out, must mobilise, must get on side for peace, and must have the courage to work to stop the killing. And Rafaella is absolutely right to emphasise mobilisation and international coordination essential to bringing an end to this war. This is a difficult moment. We're in no doubt about that, but we must do everything possible together to stop this bloody war. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. Just to reiterate, as she said, we've got to build this demonstration. I could see in the chat as Kate was speaking, lots of contributions from across the United Kingdom specifically, asking how to get down to London, asking what they can do to build. So please just email office@stopwar.org.uk. We can send you leaflets. We're organising various local groups are organising leafleting sessions, stalls in the run-up to the demonstration in 2 weeks' time on February the 25th. So do get in touch, and we can get you in touch with other people in your local area to build it. It's really important we get out onto the streets. I myself was at a local group stall on Saturday just for an hour or so, and it really goes a long way. So please get involved if you can. Okay, so we move on now to our final speaker of this evening. She needs not much of an introduction. It's Lindsey German, the convener of the Stop the War Coalition. Over to you, Lindsey.
Okay, thank you very much, Shadia, and thanks so much to all the previous speakers. It's a great privilege to be on this panel because we've been on panels before, many of us, and we've spoken together before. But I think, as Kate has just said, we're in a difficult moment, and therefore there's not just a premium on peace, there's also a premium on people standing up for peace and standing up to be counted against what our government is doing and what governments are doing around the world in terms of promoting this arms push to Ukraine. And Rafaella referred to the events 20 years ago, February the 15th, 2003, where we had 2 million people on the streets of London, where in Italy they had huge demonstrations across the whole country, and in Spain as well, which were they were the main allies in Europe of Tony Blair. And we had those millions of people, 30 million people estimated around the world demonstrated over that weekend on every continent. We didn't stop the war, and we said if we don't stop the war, it isn't just going to be about what happens in Iraq, terrible though that was. It's going to have real consequences across the world as a whole. What have we seen since then? Arms spending has doubled in the last 20 years worldwide. Last year, it achieved the distinction that arms spending internationally is now at $2 trillion. This is the legacy of failing to stop the war in Iraq. The situation in the world has been increasingly unstable. There's been a breakdown of international relations over that period. At the same time, there's been much, much more armament. And now we see the situation between Ukraine and Russia. Now, I think for all of us, and certainly we in Stop the War, were very strongly opposed to the invasion, and we said it wasn't justified in any way. The truth is, though, that this is a war which isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. It's a war between NATO and the NATO powers, particularly the United States, but between all of the NATO powers and Russia. And therefore, this is between two sides who are nuclear armed, two sides where you're talking about a war which is going on in Ukraine, which is, as Tariq completely correctly said, is not being won by either side. You've got a war of attrition going on. And when people talk about the First World War, it always sounds kind of very dramatic. How could it possibly be that things will get as bad as the First World War, where millions of people died as a result of that war? And we had 4 years of misery for the peoples of Europe and further afield. But the truth is that the sleepwalking we're talking about now is exactly the way in which the various powers of Europe managed to get themselves into not just one war between two particular conflicting countries, but into a world war which brought in absolutely everybody. And when I hear NATO, Jens Stoltenberg saying yesterday that NATO is in an ammunition race with Russia in order to supply more and more ammunition to Ukraine in what is now a war of attrition, which is like the First World War in areas like Bakhmut. It's got very great similarities. It is an absolutely terrifying prospect. And again, as Rafaella completely correctly said, no one has the right. The Ukrainians have the right to defend themselves. They have the right to self-determination. They have the right to do all those things. They do not have the right, and nobody has the right, to drag the world into a war which would be a bigger and more destructive war, and we've seen two in the last century, than anything that we've seen before. So I think we have to start with that fact, and that has to be, when you look at the way in which arms are being built up, nowhere encouraged more so than by the British government. The British government has played a really, really bad role in the past year in terms of all of these things. What have they done? Boris Johnson last April scuppered any chance of peace talks when they were possible. He flew to Kiev to make it absolutely clear that Britain wouldn't support negotiations or peace talks. He has been the one who has been drumming up support for tanks. You know, last year, Joe Biden said, we can't send tanks to Ukraine. That would be the equivalent of starting World War III. Well, here we are, and the US and Germany and a whole number of other countries are sending tanks to Ukraine, and therefore the greater threat of starting a much, much greater conflict. You also have the situation where we saw Vladimir Zelensky in Parliament in Britain last week. Now, if you look at that speech and what that speech was about, that was a speech about war. It wasn't a speech about peace. It wasn't, I mean, Yurii quite rightly said, you know, he quotes Churchill because that always presses the buttons of all the Tory MPs and quite a few of the Labour ones. But it was nothing to do with peace. It was nothing to do with the wider politics. It was about saying, you gave us tanks last week. Now we want planes, fighter planes this week. Now, this was only days after Biden and Scholz had already said, we're not going to send fighter planes. But this is part of the operation that Britain says it's going to send its Typhoon jets, never mind that there aren't any Typhoon jets to spare to go to Ukraine, and that actually they're totally unsuitable for the kind of warfare that is being fought in Ukraine. But they're saying, let's send these. What is it about? Britain says we're going to send Challenger tanks, we're going to send Typhoon jets. The pressure then internationally is to send more and more. And it's an absolute shame, in my opinion, that all of the parliamentarians, I saw the quotes from Labour, left Labour MPs saying how marvellous it was, how good Zelensky was, how great it is. Yes, we've got to support him. Maybe we should send aircraft. You have it from the Greens in Parliament who were putting similar arguments about how impressive it is. These are people who supposedly are on the left, but who are uncritically going along with a government which they know is warmongering, which they know does not have the interests of working class people at heart, either in this country or in Ukraine. They really couldn't care less about any of those things. They're going along with this pretense that these weapons are going to bring peace. They're not going to bring peace. They're going to bring greater war, if anything. And you know, we have to look at what is going on here. The terrible earthquake in Turkey and Syria, which has cost tens of thousands of lives, and they estimate many, many more thousands of lives. The British government is pledging £5 million as long as the public takes £5 million as well. So it's going to match the donations of people, working class people who are giving money to help the victims of that earthquake. This government, 5 million, which has already given 2.3 billion to Ukraine in weapons last year, and which has pledged to give another 2.3 billion to Ukraine this coming year as well. Now, there is something obscene about people who talk about protecting human rights, caring about life, doing all this sort of thing, and having these double standards. And we know they have the double standards, not just over the war, over refugees, over all sorts of things where they talk about wanting to help people, but in reality, there is a very, very different agenda. So it seems to me this is a situation where we're faced with major imperialist war between major powers, the threat of war breaking out, not just in Eastern Europe and the possibility of nuclear war, but also what's called the new Cold War with China, but which is actually rapidly becoming a hot war as the United States seems to be shooting down unidentified objects, which are supposedly spy balloons on a daily basis at the moment. And this is these things can lead very, very quickly to direct armed conflict. So there's a great deal here at stake. And I think we've got to be clear about that. Tariq said that we're not going to get hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. We're in a minority at the moment, but we're in a minority which is right. And we're in a minority which understands that we need to group our forces now in order to say there is not a bipartisan approach to this war in this country. There is growing opposition to the war. I note that particularly since Zelensky's speech last week, there are more and more people saying, really, what's going on here? Are we just going into another war without even realizing that it's happening? So I think we can get a very good demonstration on the 25th here in London. I know that there are things that are happening in other parts of the world, and we're hoping to coordinate and link up with those demonstrations as much as possible. But I would say to you, when people march, when we had the 2 million people on the streets, I think one of the reasons so many people came out was they felt it was very, very important for them individually to be there because they would help to actually stop the war. Now, we're in a very different situation, but in a sense, it is as important in times like this, when we're in a minority, it is as important for people to stand up to be counted. It is as important for people to say, we're going to fight back. We have a big problem with the Labour Party being so supportive of war and even encouraging more defence spending. We have a big problem with the trade union movement, which last year in this country very narrowly passed a resolution calling for more money to be spent on defence spending, which means effectively a cut in health and education and all the other areas of spending. So we have a problem, and we have to say, okay, if we understand that the war is wrong, it isn't just a question of sitting there and throwing things at the television and complaining about what Keir Starmer's doing, all of which is perfectly justified. It is about saying, what are we going to do? And that really starts with building a fight back here in Britain, with building a fight back internationally, and getting as many people as possible that we can out on the 25th of February, because it is crucially important that we do stand up and say, this war is wrong, we need peace now, and we are determined to get it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lindsey, and thank you to everybody who spoke on the platform this evening. And of course, thank you to everybody that joined here online. At the heights of it, there were around 350 people, which is absolutely brilliant. It has been an excellent rally, and I hope that you can take all of these arguments into your respective circles to keep building for this absolutely vital demonstration, whether it's here in central London or in cities across Europe and even further afield. Get out onto the streets and do all that we as collectives and individuals can do for peace now. Thanks so much everybody for joining, and if you're not a member of Stop the War Coalition, please become a member and get active and get on the streets. Thank you everybody. Good night.